Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this video on how to build an effective cover letter. My name is Heath Queen, and I'm the internship coordinator in Compass and Career Services at Wittenberg University. And I'm excited to get to share a little bit of information with you today about how to write an effective cover letter, what are some best practices you want to implement, what the formatting is, and just what type of content goes in the letter overall. So we're going to spend some time going through that. Hopefully this is helpful for you as you prepare for job, internship, or graduate program applications after your time at Wittenberg. I like to start, though, by posing a question that is often asked of us when we meet with students surrounding cover letters in career services, and that is, do I really need to write a cover letter for every job that I apply for? And this is really, it can be broken down into two questions. One, do I need to write a cover letter for every job, even if an employer doesn't request it? And two, do I need to write a unique cover letter for every job that I'm applying for? And the answer to both of those questions is most surely yes. You should be writing a cover letter for each job that you're applying for. Um, you want to make sure that you are submitting one even though an employer may not request it, and you want to submit one that's uniquely tailored for the job in which you're applying for. And you don't want to use a generic cover letter that you are just papering the world with or using for every internship or job that you are seeking. Partially, this is because the cover letter speaks and is a way that you can speak to the position and the company specifically and call out how you would be a fit for them. You want to do this also because other candidates are surely going to submit them. If you're in competition with 150 other applicants, you don't want to be the one person who doesn't do the work of submitting and writing a cover letter. That's an easy way for a recruiter to say, well, these other people did all this work in applying for this role. Let's look at their applications first. And you don't want to be left out of that consideration just because you didn't submit one. Companies aren't always going to ask for a cover letter, but they typically will give you a space to upload it if you would like. So be mindful of that and make sure you are thinking through how you might want to do that in the future. It's also the only place, like we mentioned, where you can address the position itself. And the cover letter offers another opportunity for you to have space to include keywords and specific language from the job description that can be picked up by what we like to call the applicant tracking system. This is a fancy word, and typically you might actually not know what an applicant tracking system is. But if you've applied for a role at a major company or corporation, you've already used one. Anytime you're applying on a digital platform for a job or an internship, you are using what we call an applicant tracking system. It's a program that allows you to apply for the role. And then on the back end, the tool does a couple things. It ranks all the candidates based on a few criteria. One, the questions that they asked you in the job application. It'll use those to rank you, but it also will scan the resume and the cover letter, and it will see how dense the resume and the cover letter is in the keywords surrounding what is included in the job description. So it will look and say the job description is looking for communication and digital media skills. Where is that explicitly named in the cover letter in the job description? And depending on how well those two match in keywords will depend on how high the system will rank you on the back end. So you want to submit a cover letter because it offers you more real estate to provide and talk about those key experiences that you have that fit while using keywords from the job description. So let's talk just for a minute about what the difference is between a resume and a cover letter. I get this question often. What is the difference between the two? Really, the resume, it's a brief but detailed snapshot about your past experience, your past work experience, education, school, skills that you've developed, leadership positions. It's really just a historical document. It's a document that tells in plain and concise language, not paragraphs, plain and concise language. It tells about what you have gained from past experience. And it usually does this in bullet point format. The cover letter, on the other hand, is really what I like to see as the linking document between the resume and the job description. It's the document that tries to connect both. And obviously, the language is going to be much more in depth and much more finely finessed than what I'm about to say. But in effect, the cover letter says, I've done this, so I can do this. It has both components. It addresses your past experience and calls out examples, but it also calls out language and duties and responsibilities that the job description lists that you're applying for, or the graduate program lists. This is done using examples, calling out language from the job description, and we like to say that the cover letter should be using I statements. We recognize that a lot of your projects that you've done in class and maybe in internships that you've had already, a lot of those projects may be team efforts, and that's great. You want to give credit where credit's due to the team, but on the cover letter, they're they're not hiring the team, they're hiring you. And so you want to talk about your own individual personal contributions to that work, even if it was done in a team setting. And you do that through using I statements. Okay, so that's a little bit about the difference between both documents. Now we're going to go through the general format of a cover letter. I'm going to run through the general format, give you some general tips, and then we'll go through each section in more detail. Obviously, you can see this here. The cover letter is set up in a general letter format, probably how you learned to write a letter back in third grade and then haven't used it since. That's common. We don't tend to write hand letters and mail them anymore, but this is going to follow that format that you might have learned back then. Generally, it's going to start with your information at the top, have a date for when you're writing the letter, organization information, uh, a traditional greeting, an intro paragraph and personal thesis statement, which we'll talk about, some supporting paragraphs that back up that thesis statement, a closing paragraph, and a signature. You will notice that outside of the the greeting and the closing and the information at the top, this looks a lot like your academic writing. You have an introduction with a thesis statement, you back it up with some points in supporting paragraphs, and then you close with a closing paragraph. That's pretty simple to think about as you're writing the letter. You can follow a similar format or theme as you might for an academic paper when writing the cover letter. It just so happens to be to have those added letter format things into it at the same time. So some overall tips. It's going to still be written using concise and professional language, not colloquial language. So language you might just use to talk to someone when you're walking down the street. That's not language we'd want to use on a cover letter. We also try to use standard 1-inch margins on all sides. If you get to 1 inch, or if you can't fit everything in 1-inch margins, I would say that that cover letter is probably a bit too long. The example I just showed you is actually probably a little bit longer than what you might want to do. But it's still a fine cover letter. It's not wrong for the length of it, but it's a tad longer than what you might be writing for a job or an internship that you're applying for in the future. The key though is 1-inch margin should be perfectly fine and give you enough room for what you want to do on the cover letter. You should also make sure that the document is single spaced. The paragraphs do not need to have double spacing. They should be single spaced, but you should put some space between each paragraph. But as far as the document itself, the body paragraph should not be double spaced. And like the resume, you want to save this as a PDF before sending to an employer, primarily because you just want to keep the formatting and make sure none of the formatting goes off the rails once it's opened on an employer's computer using whatever software or whatever package or year of Word or PDF or whatever that they're using. You also want to be proofreading the document and not simply relying on spell check. Spell check is not going to work for everything. It's not going to catch errors that are actually correct. And you don't want to miss errors in your writing just because you're relying only on spell check. Dr. Madison in the English department actually taught me a helpful trick that I think might be useful for you all in the sense of trying to read the cover letter from bottom to top rather than top to bottom when you're proofreading. This gets you out of the normal flow of the letter. Sometimes, you're naturally remembering what you wrote as you kind of go through the paragraph if you're reading it top to bottom. And that helps you kind of naturally know what you've said without actually having to read it in detail. But when you're reading it from bottom to the top, you can't get lost in the flow of how you originally wrote the letter. It actually seems a little disjointed and helps you read it in more detail to catch those mistakes that might be there. So shout out to Dr. Madison. Thank you for that helpful advice. You also want to avoid run-on sentences. In the cover letter, it's very easy to get caught up in run-on sentences. And that means you're talking about sometimes very complex projects and assignments that you worked on, very complex things that you've done in your field of study. that can be very difficult to write in simple, plain language. But you need to make sure you're catching yourself when you're writing sentences that just go on and on and on. They take up like 3 or 4 lines. You want to try to catch that. We're also going to list numbers as digits rather than spelling them out on the cover letter just because numbers pop. We are going to try to use verb tenses consistently throughout and not overusing punctuation like the exclamation point. Exclamation points are fine, but when every sentence or every other sentence is an exclamation point, it can communicate to the reader a tone that you might not necessarily intend. And it can seem a little bit like you might be yelling at them at times. So try not to use punctuation too much, like exclamation point, for example. So let's take some time and go through each individual section of the cover letter now. We're going to start by talking a little bit about the personal info and date, which is at the top of the cover letter. This can seem pretty simple, but there are some things here you might want to just take into consideration and remember. And the first is make sure the address and the email and the phone are professional, and make sure that it agrees with what's on the resume. You don't want to have two different addresses, two different email addresses or whatever on both documents. In fact, one way to fix this and to make sure this is the case is to just automatically use the header from the resume on your cover letter. I like to use the same header text so that both documents look consistent with that information. You also include a date here. Then we go into another section where we start talking about the company. We address them, their address, city, state, and zip, and we have a greeting where we identify who it is that we're writing the letter to. Make sure that you're using the full legal name of the company. Sometimes if it's a popular company that everyone knows in your town or a national brand or a school, it can be easy to use the shortened lingo for the organization. So if you're applying to Target, it's easy to just say Target. But their legal name, their full company name is actually the Target Corporation. And so you want to make sure you're using that name when you're addressing them on the cover letter. You're not always going to know what department you're applying to and who you're applying to. I would say if you don't know the department, human resources is what's used here, but at other companies, it could be called recruiting department or talent acquisition. If you don't know the department, then don't include it. Just use the company name and leave it at that. However, in your greeting, you want to try to address it to someone or some group of people. If you know exactly who it is, that's great. If not, you can use a simple term like hiring manager or search committee. Those are general enough they're universal among all organizations, and so it's easy to just use that generic term and still be addressing it to someone. But you want to use a direct name or group of people if you can, or if you have that information. So let's talk and go through the intro now. The intro, the first paragraph, and the thesis statement. This section typically identifies who you are and what you're applying for. It gives a one-sentence thesis statement that really summarizes your skill sets and experience and sets up the trajectory that you're going to take throughout the rest of the letter. So the thesis statement should give a preview to the supporting points you're going to make in the paragraphs that follow. It's focused on the value that you bring to the company. You don't want to spend the whole first paragraph of the cover letter only talking about what you hope to gain from the experience. You want to talk to them about the value that you individually bring. And if you have personal connections or people who are recommending you or told you about the role, you can name them here in the first paragraph, as long as they know you're naming them and have given you permission to use their name in your job application materials. So let's just read through this at the beginning and talk about some of those components before going on to the supporting paragraphs. So it says, my name is John Smith, and I'm applying for the program coordinator position with the Masters of Business Analytics program at Wittenberg University. I bring a wealth of experience in higher education at all levels, including administration. I believe that I would be a great fit for this role based on my experience in program planning, customer service, and with interpersonal communication skills. So obviously, first line, they're identifying who they are and what they're applying for. John Smith, and they're applying for the program coordinator position. And then in the last line, we get the thesis statement where they say, I believe that I would be a great fit for this role based on their experience in program planning, customer service, and interpersonal communication skills. And you will notice that the thesis statement will start to set up the ways in which they write their supporting paragraphs after this. So then you'll go into supporting paragraphs. And each one of those paragraphs will be themed around an experience or skill set that you are leveraging that is mentioned or presupposed in the thesis statement. So here we have program planning and we have customer service. Those were two things mentioned in the thesis statement. There's a third, but just for space room or space considerations, I only included two here. But they're using those to build out the paragraphs. You want to try to give concrete examples from the past. Don't just say you have the experience, but show how you developed it from your past experience. And you also want to try to connect it with language from the job description. Uh, the bullet points are how we or what we're using in this example cover letter. The bullet points with the bold titles for each paragraph, that is not required by any means. And if you're in a graduate program, I would recommend not using the bullet points and titles. But if you're applying to a traditional role, we like using these partially because they provide a way for a recruiter to see exactly what the theme of those paragraphs are so they can read what's important to them, read what they're really interested in, rather than having to go through the entire letter. It helps them as they're skimming, and it makes sure that their eyes are immediately drawn to what's most important. So let's just read this first one. Program planning and administration experience. I managed and evaluated the accelerated programs at Thomas More College for 3 years. I also served as a liaison between departments, and I built strong relationships with faculty, staff, students, and community partners. This experience will allow me to navigate your campus culture easily in order to build effective bridges with the graduate program. So obviously they mentioned their example, their work at Thomas More College, and they also connected it with what they need to do in the role that they're applying for. They named stuff from the job description or the job role with Wittenberg. They talk about how they're going to be able to use this experience to build effective bridges. So you want to do both. You want to use experience from your past and call out examples and call out the job description and what they're asking you to do. Then after you're done with that, we'll get to the end and you'll have a closing and a signature. Let me just read this to start off with. It would be an honor to be granted an interview for this position. I look forward to hearing from you and am available for any questions that you might have. Thank you for considering my application. Always thank them for their time, request an interview or open yourself up to an interview, and for additional questions that they might have about your submission. I always typically like to add an appropriately sized written handwritten signature at the end rather than using cursive fonts or something like that. If you don't have a digital copy of your signature, an easy way to do it would be to take a full sheet of white paper with a Sharpie, sign your name on the entire sheet of paper. Not just a little corner, but the entire sheet, sign your signature using a Sharpie, scan it into your computer as a JPEG or an image file. And then you can save that and insert it into these documents and resize it to make sure it's appropriate. But you want it to be a small enough signature so it doesn't look too out of place on the cover letter. Okay, so that's the general format. I have a few last bits of advice for you before we're done. You want to try as much as possible to adjust the voice of your writing to the company or the organization. Read up on their mission, their values, how they talk about themselves, how they talk about their culture, their employees, and try to write in that voice if at all possible. It's not always going to be easy to do or easy to discern for some companies, depending on how much information is out there, but you should try to write in the voice of the organization if you can. Order the most relevant skills first in your paragraph order. Don't put your most relevant skills as the last supporting paragraph, like put them higher up on the document. And then portray yourself in a positive light. Don't apologize for what you don't have, or don't try to make excuses on the cover letter. You want to try your hardest to portray yourself in a positive light on that document. I always like to say, who you aren't isn't as interesting as who you are. So don't spend time talking about why you left your last job, or why you don't have a certain skill set, or why you don't have experience that's requested. That's stuff you can talk about in an interview if it comes up. But just try to talk well of yourself on that document. Okay. Hopefully this is helpful and giving you a good start to see what cover letter writing is all about. Feel free to reach out to Career Services if you want us to take a look at a cover letter for you, edit it, or provide notes or feedback. We'd be happy to do so. But if you can implement all of these practices in writing a cover letter for each position that you apply for, you're going to do a lot better at telling your story, telling the value that you're bringing to an organization when you're submitting your application. So thanks for watching and have a great day.